Hi there, this is Phil with Phil Effects, and we've got a new school year, so I've got some new tutorials here. This is a tutorial we want to talk about importing assets into After Effects, in particular importing PDF file or PSD files from Photoshop and Illustrator files, and then do a little bit more walking around the interface and show you a few more things in working with After Effects. So let's go ahead and get started here. So I've got a project. This is actually a semi-completed project of what I want to do. Let's go ahead and we'll open up a blank one, and we can start with the template that we use in class. And so here's our 184 standard template, and let's open that up. And so we've got our blank template, and you can see from the comp size we're at 720 by 405, set for 10 seconds at 30 frames or 29.97 frames per second. And we've walked around this just a little bit. Let's see, I'm using the standard setup here, and we've got our comp in here. So when we want to import assets into After Effects, there's a number of different ways you can do it. One is you can go over here to File and say import file, or import multiple files. Actually, you don't really need to do this. You can just go import file and you can get multiple files. So that's one way to do it. Another way is to right click in the project window, and you can say import files, multiple files. The way that I prefer to do it really is just with the project panel selected, and you can see the blue outline there. I just double click, and by double clicking in that project panel, and that works for Windows or Macintosh or Windows, it'll open up a file browser. So I've got a number of assets here that we want to bring in. And let's start with bringing in just a couple of things. When I said you can bring in assets and you can bring in multiple ones, so we can bring in multiple assets, and the way to bring in multiple assets at once with the file browser open, I can go in and I can just, let's say I want to bring in this movie, and I want to bring in the MP3 We're in a Bar, and Arnold saying I'll be back. And because they're all continuous here, I can just hold down Shift and select those three and say open, and it brings them all in. All right, let me double click again, and if I wanted to bring in discontinuous selections, let's say I wanted to bring in this PNG up here and this JPEG down here, so I can select this, and I can say hit Control or Command on a Macintosh, or Control on a PC, and select Not, and then say Open, and it brings in both of those. If we want to bring in a tiff file, tiff files are a little bit interesting because of the way that they handle transparencies. So I can click on the tiff file and say open, and that brings in a dialog box, and it wants to know, After Effects wants to know what you want to do with the alpha layer. And if you're not sure, 99% of the time, just go in here and you can just click on guess, and After Effects will make the right selection. In this case, it's going to bring in the alpha layer straight and unmounted. We say OK, and that brings that in. And if we take a look at the tiff and the PNG files, all right, I can take this tiff file and just drop this over here, and you can see that the tiff actually does have transparency, because you can see the checkerboard transparency in the background. And in dragging that over, it actually placed that picture into my comp. If I don't want that in there, I can just select that and delete that. If we look at the PNG, it's the same kind of thing. This PNG file also has transparency, and we can see that it's transparent in the background. Note that both of these files are bigger than our composition. Our composition is 720 by 405. Our tiff is 960 by 540, and our PNG is 960 by 540. If you wanted to create a new composition, one thing that you can do is I could take this knot and take it and hold it and just drop it right on this little, looks like a little film strip. That's going to create a new comp, but watch what that does. If I do that, okay, we created a new comp called knot, and note the size of that composition is actually what the size of the picture is. So here's this composition and called knot, and the size of knot is 960 by 540, and the size of the tiff is 960 by 540. That's why when in class I want you to use the template that I provided for you, because if you start by using the template, and then your comp is going to be the 720 by 405. If you don't have a composition created and the very first thing you do is import a file, the After Effects is going to assume that the size of the composition is going to be the size of that file. And let's say you downloaded a file from the internet and the size of that file is 4,000 by 2,000. Well, that's going to create a composition that's 4,000 by 2,000, which is significantly bigger than what we want to be using. So that's why you want to always start with that template. So we brought in some assets here. Let's bring in some more. So I go in here and I'll double click. And now let's bring in a Photoshop file. So I've got this Phoenix Bear from Phoenix College, and it's a Photoshop file. And I click on this. Now with Photoshop and Illustrator files in particular, it looks a little bit different in Windows because Windows automatically shows the options. OS 10 on Macintosh doesn't, but there's a button down here called Options. So I select on the PSD and I click on my options, and there's some options on how I can bring this file in. Now I can bring it in as footage, or I can bring it in as a composition, or a composition retain layer sizes. Now 99.99% of the time what you want to do with a Photoshop file is you want to bring it in, and you want to bring it in as a composition, and you want to retain the layer sizes. The reason for that is if you bring it in as footage and you had layers in this file, and let's look at this file. Here's this file, and I can open this up, and let's open up. We can get the file here, and there's the file. So if we look at this, I have layers in this file, and you can see the layers. So I have a right cuff and a right hand open, a lower arm, an upper arm. So there's numerous layers that were used to construct the Phoenix Bear logo, and this was constructed this way. So if I wanted to animate this character, I could animate the upper arm, the lower arm, the hands, the eyes, the torso, and the legs, and so on and so forth. And when we get into character animation, this is how you want to do things. But for this exercise, the only thing that's important here is that we have numerous layers. The other thing is, when you bring a Photoshop file in and you want to use it for character animation, you don't want any hierarchy. You can see here I don't have any grouping in any of my layers, all right? So everything is all a single layer. There are no groups, so there's no hierarchy that I've created in Photoshop. That goes the same for Illustrator. If you bring in a character that you designed in Illustrator, you don't want to put a hierarchy into that. So we have the Photoshop file. I want to import this, and like I said, if we bring it in as footage, it's just going to be flat, meaning all of those layers that you saw will be gone. If I bring it in as just a composition, what will happen is, let me open this Photoshop file up again. What will happen is if I have right upper arm, and I go over here to the right upper arm, and if I selected that, what would happen is the size of the right upper arm would be the size of this entire window. In other words, it's the size of the entire composition. If I bring it in and I just make it the layer size, then what it will be is just the size of this upper arm. And that's what you really want when you want to be working with layers. So we want to bring in a composition, we want to retain layer sizes, and let's open this up. And After Effects verifies that that's what I want. In fact, I want editable layer styles. This is another feature that actually if you put some styles in Photoshop, those styles actually will come across in After Effects, and you can animate and change those in After Effects. Not all of the styles, but many of the styles. So let's go ahead and say OK. We bring that in, and you notice we have a composition here, and it's the composition of the Phoenix Bear, the size of the comp. It automatically makes that. That's actually bigger than what I want, but we have all of these layers, and here's each of the layers for each of the pieces that makes that Phoenix Bear. So let's bring in another one, and let's bring in the Illustrator version of the Phoenix Bear. Same kind of thing. I want to look at options, and it behaves the same way. If I do footage, it's going to flatten it. I'm going to lose all my layers. I bring in composition, it'll bring it in, but each item is going to be the size of that whole composition, which is not what we want. We want to bring it in, and we want to retain the layer sizes. So let's go ahead and open that. And we have another comp, and that comp is the Phoenix Bear that came through Illustrator. And note we have a folder here, and here's each of those layers that we brought in that makes that Phoenix Bear. I think I brought in just about everything I want. Let's see, I brought in my tiffs, I brought in my bears, I brought in my movie, I brought in some sound files, I brought in my nano, and let's see, and yeah, I think I got everything I want. So now I have this composition here, and what we want to do is we'd like to be able to straighten this out just a little bit better. All right. So note again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create some folders in here. And one of the easiest ways to do this is if you go onto the keyboard, just under the escape key, there's a little curly Q line key that's called a tilde. And if I select the project panel and hit the tilde key, it takes and expands it to the full size. Now that works in Windows and in OS 10, and it works like a toggle. So I can just continually hit that, and it actually does that with any window. So if I take my timeline and select the timeline, hit the tilde key, it makes it the full size. Hit it again, it toggles back. If I have the comp and hit that, it goes to the full size. Hit it again, it goes back. So let's work in here. And the quickest way to do this essentially is if we sort things by type. So if I sort things by type, you can see we have compositions. And I have some folders that's some of my assets. And I've got some sound files, a movie file, and some TIFF files. And the way I like to organize things is I like to keep all the comps together. I like to keep sound files separate and movie files separate, and picture, and essentially pictures and assets, I kind of group those together. So let's go in here and we'll create a folder. So we create a folder, and let's call this assets. All right. And I can take the Phoenix Bear and I can put that in there, and take this and put that in there. And I said I wanted to put my pictures in there, so I'm going to take my picture and put that in there, and take my PNG, put that in there, and my TIFF, and I'll put that in there. And let's create a new folder, and let's call this comps. And we'll put in comp 1 into there, take the knot, bear, put that one, and then let's create a new one, call this audio, and we'll take my MP3, put that in there, and my WAV file, we'll put that in there. And then because I only have one movie file, I'll just maybe leave that one open, or what I could do is I can actually create another folder and call this movies. And I could take the butterfly movie, and I'll put that inside there. So now I have this all sorted out. Note, however, that these folders have nothing to do with what's going on in your computer. So here's my file structure that's on my Mac, and none of that changed. In other words, this folder structure simply exists within After Effects, and it only exists to help you kind of do some housekeeping on your project. So let's hit the tilde key, we'll close that down again, and like I said, I did some housekeeping there. So let's take a look at some of the other things that we've got here. So we've straightened out my project panel, and so let's go down and let's look at the composition. The composition window, I'm not going to go through all of the controls on here, but I want to show you a few things, the things that you'll use most common. And the things that you will use most often are one, your scaling, and that can be found down here. And so you have the ability to scale up and down. Very often if you have something that's very big, like you have a very big picture, let's go in here and we'll open up comp 1, and comp 1, note that we had, if we go to my comps and I select comp 1 is 720 by 405. So let's go into my assets, and I have this big knot here, and I'm going to take that and drop it inside my comp 1. And then that picture is bigger than the size of my comp. So here's my comp, and we can see the picture is bigger, and currently it's scaled at 200%. Well, let me knock this down a little bit, and there we can see that the size of the picture, that's what this boundary is significantly bigger than the size of the comp. So we can fix that. Let me go in and let me just kind of zoom to this, and I can zoom out just a little bit. And if I go into this knot, there's a number of ways I can do this. So I can go in and I can just grab this handle and start scaling, but you can see there's a problem with that where I'm not scaling it uniform. If I hold the shift key while I do that, all right, that will scale it uniformly. So it scales the same in X as it does in Y. So that's one way to scale it. Another way to scale this, let me hit Control Z, is on every layer that you have has transforms. And there's a transform here called scale. And so let me show you some quick keyboard shortcuts. So if I select a layer and I just type the word S, I know that S stands for scale. And so I want to be able to change the scale on this, and at the moment it's going to do both uniformly, so I can grab this and scale that down. And let's say I wanted to move the position. Well, with this selected, if I hold down the shift key and hit the letter P, that brings up position. And so I can move this now in its position. This gets very handy because very often when you're working with animations, you don't want to see all of the transforms like we have here. You just want to see the ones that are most important to you, in this case scale and position. So I can go back again, do this, and I can hit P. That shows me position. If I hold down shift and type S, it gives me scale. If I hold down, now you might think that the shortcut for opacity is O. It turns out it's not. The shortcut for opacity is T, which is really transparency. And so we have that. Do shift P, shift S for scale, shift R for rotation, and shift A for anchor point. We won't talk about anchor points today, but that's what that is. And these work like a toggle. So if I hold down shift and hit P again, it removes P, it removes position. Shift S removes the scale, shift R removes the rotation. Let's say go in here and I want to show something real quick again too. Let's put position, show position and scale and opacity. All right, so let's go in and, for example, I want to put in some keyframes. Well, the way that we add keyframes, when you see these watches here, that means everything that has a watch, stopwatch, can be keyframed. So I can go in here and I can keyframe the scale, and let's go out in time, and I'll change that. And then we'll go in time again, and I'll change that back down. And then go a little bit in time, and now I want to keyframe position, and I want to move position to down here, and then out here I want to move the position over here and up there. So I've added some keyframes. All right, my knot here is just moving around the screen, and if I twirly this all up, let's say I have a layer and all I want to see are properties that have been animated. I don't want to see anything else. Well, if you select the layer and you hit the shortcut U, just type the U key, what it'll display is any parameter that has a keyframe on it. This is really handy, especially when you get lots and lots and lots of layers. And so it's very, very nice to be able to display that and show that. So let's see, I diverted just a little bit to show you some things on the keyframes with the timeline. Let's go back and look at the comp window. So in the comp window we had scaling. The other thing here is you can do the color management. So we can see at the moment we're seeing RGB. If you wanted to see just the red channel, that's the red channel. That's just the green channel. That's the blue channel. This is the alpha channel. The alpha channel is, this is what is black is what is transparent, and what is white you're seeing is where the actual image is. If we go back to RGB, we'll see this in color. The next drop down shows the resolution that After Effects is displaying. This has nothing to do with rendering. This has to do with display only. So at the moment, it's only rendering it at half of the accuracy. So it's rendering 2 pixels at a time, not every single pixel. And in doing so, it looks much coarser. If I scale this up, you can see the jaggies there, all right? If I go in here and say full, you can see how that's smoothed out, all right? If we go down to 1/4, that gets really jaggy. And now you might ask, why would you want to do that? Well, this is a very simple scene, and I only have one object, and so it's very fast and it's very quick and easy for my computer to render it. If I had lots and lots and lots of objects, it can really slow down the machine when it's trying to update things in real time. You can speed up the performance of your machine by cutting down the resolution at which you render while you're working with your object. Again, like I said, what's on here has nothing to do with the final render. It just has to do with display rendering when you're working with your project. Let's go over and look at these 2 panels. So at the moment it's telling me that it's displaying the active camera, and I have 1 view. You can actually go in and we can look at 2 views. And so here is a top view, and because this is a 2-dimensional object, not a 3-dimensional object, having a top view doesn't make much sense. If I made this a 3-dimensional object, which I could do by clicking on this, note this is now a 3D object, and if I select it, okay, I can move this now in Z space. See how I'm moving that? And you're looking top down. Now it has no width. That's because, think of this as a piece of paper and you're looking down on the edge of the piece of paper when we go into 3D mode. And so I can push this back in Z space, which is pushing it away from the camera, and I can bring it forward and pull it closer to the camera. And note that After Effects automatically does scaling, and we're seeing both views at the same time. If I remove this and I make it 2D again, the top view and the active camera are basically the same kind of view. You can see here we can do multiple views. We can have 4 views. Depending upon what you're doing, you may have a need for this. If you have lots of cameras, you want to be able to see how things are positioned. Having 4 views is very, very handy. Most of the time what you'll typically do is you'll be either working with 1 view or you'll be working with 2 views. And that pretty much shows what is going on there. The other thing that you'll see out here, and sometimes you'll do this and not realize what you've done, and you'll do it by accident, but if I take this and I double click on the knot layer, what happened is a new tab came up here, and this is called the layer view. So I have my comp view. The comp view is this entire composition. All right, at the moment I only have one thing in the comp. Let's go ahead and let's put something in the background here. So I have this guy, and I'll put him in the background, and scale this up. So I have this picture in the background, and I have the knot in the foreground. So there's two pictures in my composition, and we're seeing those two pictures in my comp view. Now if I go up to my layer view, that's only showing this knot layer. And this looks entirely different, all right? What we're seeing here is, if this was a movie, it would be showing me the in and the out of the movie relative to how we're seeing it here. And if I wanted to do what's called creating a mask, I would create the mask on the layer view, not in the composition view. We'll talk about creating masks and doing tracking and things like that later. But you would use the layer view for creating masks, and you would use the layer view for doing things relative to tracking. Let's go back to our comp view, and let's look down here at the timeline just a little bit before we go on things. So in the timeline, you can see that there's over here we have a couple of layers in my scene. And we have these icons here. These are probably somewhat a little bit mysterious, and in fact I can even enable more things here to the left by clicking these icons here, and you can see many things are now brought up. And there's a number of things I have here. First off, I have a graph editor. So if I have an animation like I do, and I call it my graph editor, I can see my animations graphically. We won't get into this today, but if you're familiar with working with graph editors and animation, you have that capability in After Effects. So let's turn that back off. So there's a number of parameters that we have here. There's the blending mode. If you're familiar with Photoshop and you have layers, you can work on blending modes. There's a thing called a track mat. We'll talk about that later. Parenting has to do with animation, and so you can have properties of one layer control properties of another layer. You do that through parenting. In and out and duration, these have to do with when the layer is active, when it comes in and when it goes out. At the moment, my ins and outs are all the same length as my whole composition. If I wanted to make those different, I could do that. All right. Let's turn a couple of these back off so we can see things, and let's look at the timeline over here. So in the timeline, I can take the top bar, and the top bar has to do with how much time in the comp is visible at once. And I can take and stretch this down, and you can see I'm getting a lot more resolution on a per frame basis, but I see less and less of the entire composition. So that's kind of like scaling out the whole comp. I can take this and stretch this back, and so now I see the whole comp. And then this bar here, this was my workspace. And we talked about this last week. And so this comes in very handy because I can modify my work area, and if I want to see how my animation is proceeding just between 1 second and 2 seconds, I can put this in here and then hit play, and it's only going to repeat for that time. And in fact, I can go in here and make that less, and it's going to repeat only for the length of time that I have for my work area. The other thing is if you have defined a work area and then you go to render, After Effects will take this work area as the default, as the size that you want to render. That may not be what you want. You may have had your work area set and you've got it slid over here and you're working only between here. If you forget to do that, to change this back to the length that you want to render. And then you open up the render queue, and this is how you actually create a movie. Like I said, it's going to default to this. Now you can change it, so if you really wanted to go from, let's say, 0 to 5 seconds, you would do that, and there's one of the windows you can change with that, but I just want to let you know that that's how you do that. So we have the workspace area, we have the total viewing area, the resolution, and this bar, like I said, this is how long this picture is active. So let's go in here and actually let me grab this, and I will bring this back, and if I take this, note, as soon as that bar ends, that knot disappears, okay? Likewise, if I had this bottom iPod Nano, which is my background, the background doesn't exist until this point right here where I make it active. Okay, so this is how you control the period that a particular layer essentially is active. All right, so it starts, it will default when you place it in, it will default to be in the beginning, and it will end in the end. But if you wanted to change that, you would do that by shortening or lengthening these bars that have to do with that layer. So I think I've covered enough material here, and this should get us started and should get you a little bit more up to speed on importing assets and working with the main 3 windows that you'll spend most of your time in After Effects, and that's the project window, the composition, and the timeline. So this has been Phil with Phil Effects. Thanks a lot. Have yourself a great day.